I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Tamar Ish Shalom is one of Israel's most well-known journalists. She was the chief anchor of Channel 10, later Channel 13, for 11 years, and most recently was the host of Channel 13's Weekend News Edition. Tamar has won several prestigious awards: the B'nai B'rith Journalism Award for her documentary series on the evolving face of American Jewry, and the Givat Chaviva Award for advancing shared society between Jews and Arabs in Israel. She holds a bachelor's degree in Jewish philosophy and a master's degree in religious studies, and is currently living in the U.S. with her family on sabbatical. Tamar recently joined JPPI and launched her own new podcast called Jewish Crossroads, in which she explores how the events of October 7th and the ongoing war are reshaping Jewish identity in America. She does this through candid conversations with key Jewish figures in the U.S., tackling critical questions about solidarity, rising anti-Semitism, and the evolving relationship between American Jews and the State of Israel. 2 episodes have dropped so far, one with Rabbi David Wolpe, and the second this week with novelist Nicole Krauss. I speak to Tamar about her podcast, which I strongly recommend you listen to. I ask her how it is to be in the U.S. when dramatic news is breaking in Israel, news that she used to anchor and tell and inform the nation about. We talk about how she views the way the Israeli media have covered the war, what is happening to the politicization of some media outlets in this country, and what she has learned so far through her work on the podcast and just being in America during these very fateful months for our people, what she has learned about the Israel-Diaspora relationship. Have a listen. Hi, Tamar. Great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Yaakov. Thank you for having me.
So I'm here in Israel. You're now in the United States. On Saturday, on Shabbat, was the release of 4 of the Tatzpitaniot, 4 of the female soldiers, the soldiers who had been deployed along the border with the Gaza Strip up until October 7th. Karina Arayev, Liri Albag, Naama Levi, and Danielle Gilboa released. Agam Berger, the 5th of the Tatzpitaniot, hopefully to be released this coming weekend. But I'm curious, just from the personal perspective, as someone who for years has sat in the hot seat, has been the person reporting and delivering this news. I can imagine that up until a few months ago, it might have been you in that seat, sharing this news with the Israeli people, and what dramatic news it was. It's got to be, there's got to be some feeling there, right? Not being in that seat in that moment.
You're certainly right, Yaakov. I mean, more than one person asked me the other day if I felt that sense of FOMO on the morning of the hostage deal, given that if I were in Israel, I would probably have been anchoring the breaking news coverage, as I was, the anchor woman of the Saturday evening news broadcast. And honestly, I did anchor 2 of the evenings when hostages were released during the first hostage deal back in November 23. And I remember, those evenings as very powerful, emotional broadcasts, 6 or 7 hours long, stretching into the night. And sitting there on the anchor's chair during those moments, you could really, feel the weight of history unfolding. And it was incredibly meaningful for me to be part of that. But, I have to say that since I left, I felt completely in peace with my decision. I left at a point that I felt truly whole after many, many years of anchoring the news and breaking news. And because of that, I didn't experience any FOMO, that I wish I was in the studio. Having said that, I certainly did feel FOMO, on Shabbat and on the Sunday beforehand, but not because I wanted to be in the studio, but the only place I really wanted to be in those moments was in the hostage square in Tel Aviv. And that, I truly felt that was where I belonged to, standing alongside family, friends, and so many others. And I definitely felt like I'm missing out being there in that shared moment of solidarity and hope. So there was a FOMO, but not to anchoring the news.
I'll tell you, I very much relate to that. When I stepped down as editor of the Jerusalem Post just a few months before October 7th, right away, when October 7th happened, everyone was like, you must be missing it. You must, there's no doubt, and you know this well, Tamar, that, in the news, it's action and it's excitement, and there's a feeling of history, definitely. And there, you talk about anchoring news shows. For me, building a front page that I know will last potentially forever is also the creation of news. But I could say that it's not the feeling of not being involved. I totally relate to what you said, because in the first release of the 3 first female hostages, Dorona, Emily, and Romy, now just about 10 days ago, over the weekend, I was out of Israel. I landed back Sunday morning, and the first place I went to was to the square, to the hostage square, to be able to be there at this moment and just to be able to stand with the country. So I relate to definitely the feeling of that's, at the end of the day, we're citizens, and, we're civilians of this country. We do want to be part of it. But, the hostage deal itself, I can imagine that you do have some opinions about it, because it is one that is very much dividing the country, right? On the one hand, I don't think there's any dry eye here after watching those videos of the 4 soldiers reunite with their parents, to see the 3 hostages, the female hostages, come back last week. I mean, this is something that's very much strikes at the core of any emotion that we all have. But we are paying a very deep price for it, of releasing so many murderers, of not getting everyone back right away, of having to do this in a staged process, of who knows if stage 1 will even end, if we'll get to the end of it and get back to 33. Who knows who's alive? Who knows if we'll get to stage 2? I'm curious, just from like a different, you are an expert in these issues. What are your thoughts about the deal itself?
Well, so many people have talked with me, actually American Jews from here, that it's like a cruel reality show, isn't it? The way that it's unfolding, and it's so hard witnessing it, because these are moments of joy and grace, but of deep fear and of rage as well, when we see the high price and a lot of the uncertainty, as you mentioned, regarding the future. So I think it all goes together. And yes, I think that there is a divide, but it's mostly in the political arena, because I think that all of the polls that we see show that the vast majority of Israelis do support the deal, hard as it is, and it certainly is. And personally, I think that, beyond the complicated emotions that we all feel in these days, and a certain sense of relief, what's crucial is ensuring that each of these days is not the last one, and that we must remain committed to seeing the release of all of our hostages, and ensuring, that we will move forward to the second phase of the deal. And it is a hard phase, the second one, but so many times, we refer to this phase as a humanitarian part, but in reality, every single hostage at this point, after 15 months in hostile Gaza, is a humanitarian case. It doesn't matter if he's, a man or a woman, elderly or young. It's a humanitarian case, and we must make sure to do all in our power to bring them back home. And the price is high, and it's too high. And sometimes, when you're over the seas here, it seems as if the world thinks it's normal and it's okay that we need to pay so much for each hostage that comes back. And it seems like this equation that the world just accepts that this is the way it should. And that is frustrating. Throughout nearly a year of anchoring the news during the war, I always referred to the hostages as our brothers and sisters, and that was intentional, because I think we should all the time remind ourselves that we are part of this big family that takes care of one another. So those are
it seems, that's something that people don't understand, exactly that final point you just made, of how we're a small country. It's not even knowing necessarily a hostage, although everyone probably in this country somehow has some connection to someone, especially in the beginning when it was so many, it's 251 people. But it's that, I think it's, to me, the feeling often is that we recognize it could happen to anyone. It could happen to you, to me, to God forbid, to our parents, to our children, to our siblings. I mean, it's something that's so real in this country. I feel like that's something that Americans don't necessarily understand. And maybe that's the reason also to some extent why we are willing to pay these prices.
Yes, but I would want to relate, to how American Jews view the whole hostage issue. Because as you said, there's a Jewish aspect to it of Arvut Hadadit and Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Lazeh, but there's a very, very strong Israeli element in it of, as you described it, a small country where everybody knows one another, and this feeling that we need to take care of one another, because if not, how will our future unfold? How will it look like if we won't be able to bring back our hostages? But one of the things that deeply impressed me as an Israeli living here in the U.S., and it somewhat surprised me in terms of the scale, is that how many American Jews I've met over these past months are actively involved in this campaign to return our hostages. And so many people here wear a yellow ribbon or a hostage necklace. In Jewish schools, there's daily prayer for their release, and they count the days, every day, how many days our brothers or sisters are in hostage. And that was really moving to see. And actually, last Sunday, on the day of the first hostage release, when Romy Doron and Emily returned, I had two American friends over for brunch. Now, obviously, we scheduled this meeting weeks and even 2 months ahead, as Americans do. It's not like Israel that you just call someone, do you want to come to brunch tomorrow? And none of us knew that it will coincide with the first release of the hostages. And when they entered, one of them saw a yellow ribbon we have on the fridge always, and she showed me her yellow ribbon on her wrist that she wears for the past 15 months. And it was very clear how deep the impact is on her and how important it is for her to be with it. And she's not, she's a rather secular Jew. She visited Israel, I guess, 20 years ago. It's not part of her daily life. But that, for me, that worn out ribbon was more than just a gesture. It felt like a powerful symbol of American Jewry today, and how reunited in a sense we are.
Do you feel like Israelis fully understand that? It's interesting, that story you're telling, because I'm not sure that people here necessarily appreciate that relationship and how there are all these people, and they might do things different and look different and mark things differently, but there is this solidarity that I don't know that most Israelis are aware of.
I agree with you. If we would talk before October 7th, I think there is this optimistic opportunity right now, an opportunity that we would all be very happy to give up, and that October 7th would never happen. But given that it had, I think it has changed from the Israeli perspective as well, Yaakov, because I think that Israelis were, many of them, overwhelmed by the amount of support American Jewry gave Israel after October 7th. And I'm not talking only about money, just about contributing money to Israel, which was amazing. But I'm talking more than that, about, the delegations that we saw here of rabbis, of organization leaders, and of just, people that came to volunteer here, whether it was in Chaklaut, in the fields, or even American nurses and doctors that came for a few weeks here to help and assist in hospitals. So I think, that did resonate with many, many Israelis, and that made a difference of how we understand, our connection to one another.
So I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about, and we're here, I'll just say straight off the bat, and I said this in the introduction, we're here to talk about the new podcast that you're doing for JPPI. We're going to get there. We're going to save the best for last. But I do want to talk with you because, you're a veteran Israeli journalist, been doing this for a very long time. You have a lot of interesting insight, I think, into the Israeli media landscape. But something that has really bothered me, so let me get this off my chest for a moment, is the way the Israeli media has been covering the war in Gaza, mostly from the perspective of not showing what's happening in Gaza. Now, to all the listeners who might be now thinking, oh my God, Yaakov is going off the deep end into left-wing territory, which sometimes I do. But no, I want to make a clear disclaimer for a moment. I think what happened in Gaza is tragedy. My heart goes out to the people, the innocent Palestinians and the Palestinian civilians of Gaza. I think that the responsibility almost exclusively is on the shoulders of Hamas for what has happened. But I do think in the way they fight and embed themselves in civilian infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. However, I do think that for Israeli people to understand the scope of war, the ramifications, the price of war, we need to see what we're doing on the other side. And you know, Tamar, that our TV stations, whether it's 11, 12, 13, definitely 14, we don't show the devastation of Gaza. We don't show how Gaza has, for the most part, large parts of it have been destroyed by us, and legitimately by us, in my opinion. But we should know what we're doing. Why does the media not show this?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, Yaakov. However, I would like to differentiate between two time periods. I think that, the first time period is the days, weeks, and even few months after October 7th. I think, both of us were there, and we know how unimaginable the trauma all of us went through was. The scale of the tragedy, over 1,200 people murdered in one day, more than 250 kidnapped. These numbers were really overwhelming. And just imagine what it meant for news outlets to cover such numbers. I mean, each victim and each hostage has a name, has a family, has a story, an important story that deserved to be told with respect and with attention. And that takes time. And, I think all of us worked relentlessly for days and weeks and even months trying to provide that important coverage. I would receive WhatsApps, and I'm sure many journalists received WhatsApps messages from bereaved families asking us, begging us to tell the story of their son that went to the Nova and was murdered, or their daughter that was, a female soldier and died in field that day. And it took time to process and to report those stories. But beyond that, I think that the news cycle in those first weeks and months was crazy. I mean, there was constant sirens and rockets launched and an overwhelming flood of information and news. So I think it's completely understandable that, in the immediate aftermath of such a national grand-scale tragedy, the Israeli public and the media were mainly focused inward. However, I believe you are right that at some point much earlier on, there should have been a shift to greater coverage of what's happening in the Gaza Strip beyond the border. And, don't get me wrong, from the very first week, okay, there was reporting on Gaza. But as always, I think that the real question is about proportions, right? About the amount of coverage and its depth. And do we only go into numbers or tell stories as well? And in that sense, I think that Israeli media did not provide a sufficiently accurate picture of events, beyond the border, maybe with exceptions of Haaretz. And just to be clear, I'm not analyzing here, like giving an observation from an outsider's perspective. I'm, criticizing myself just as I'm criticizing my colleagues and other media outlets. And I think what it caused is that first, if you recall, in the first months of the operation in Gaza, there was this sense in the Israeli public that not enough done against Hamas. Meanwhile, some really high-ranking military official were quite frustrated because they say we have significant achievements, but the public isn't fully aware of them. And I think that the second thing that happened is when there was this wave of criticism against Israel in the world, I think that many Israelis didn't understand where it's coming from because they weren't fully aware of what's happening.
So, Tamar, I totally agree with you that there are these two time periods, and they're important to make a distinction. What happened in the beginning, and we had to process, of course, and then the second stage of it. But I think it also feeds in to a larger story of the commercialization of media and the way we do coverage here in Israel. We're seeing a lot of that play out also in all the different channels. But, what do you make of that bigger story that's also happening?
First of all, I agree with you that this was a just war. If this wasn't a just war against Hamas after October 7th, what is a just war? And I use the past tense because I would have hoped that we would end it earlier with a hostage deal back, in May till July. And I wish we had a plan for the future of Gaza without Hamas that should have been built, such a plan, a thing that unfortunately hasn't happened. But of course, the war against Hamas was justified, but the consequences were incredibly harsh. And just as journalists, we need to tell the stories as they are. Yeah.
The commercialization, though, of media, and I want to talk specifically for a moment, well, not specifically about Channel 13, because that is your former house, your home. I don't want to go too much into it, but I think there's a bigger story that's happening here. We're seeing the politicization of TV channels. Channel 11, Shlomo Kari, the communications minister, wants to privatize. Khan, the public broadcaster. Channel 13, there was an attempt to appoint a political crony, for the lack of a better term, of the prime minister to be the CEO, the director general of the channel that was eventually scuttled by a protest by your colleagues. Channel 12, which is, said to be, is obviously the biggest channel in the country, but is also always walking a very fine line, not to upset people too much, but kind of be the consensus. And of course, there's Channel 14, which is just a mouthpiece of Netanyahu. Israelis, I feel sometimes when you turn on the TV, we're not really getting fair, objective news anymore. We're getting entertainment based on what political agenda I might have.
Well, I don't think the news was ever objective. I don't think that we should try to be objective. I think we need to try to be fair and to be varied as we can, to give very many angles of the story. But, in my finishing words at the last broadcast that I anchored, I referred to the situation in Channel 13, wishing that the great journalists that work with me will have the chance to continue do their work with integrity and without censorship, not internal censorship and not external censorship. Because obviously at that point there was a threat to the freedom of journalism in Channel 13. Since then, I'm more optimistic. There's a new temporary CEO. Hopefully it will become permanent, that is a journalist and comes with a lot of experience and integrity. And the journalists in Channel 13 were happy to have her as a new CEO. And, I'm reading, just as you are, that there might be a new owner to Channel 13 that is coming in with an intention of, securing the freedom of press and, the independence of its journalists. So I hope we will see better days of stability for Channel 13. But as you mentioned, it's not the story of Channel 13. It's a story of all of us, whether it's Channel 12, which I do think are doing professional journalism and, criticizing when they should, and Channel 11, Channel 12, and newspapers and radio. There's a massive attack on all of us. And I think that the only thing that makes me a bit more optimistic is that I think there's this shared understanding of journalists in the past few years that this is a shared struggle and a shared fight, and you cannot only voice your concerns when it comes home or when you're under attack, because the attempt to discredit and to weaken and to control the media is vast. It's happening in many, many outlets, and the response to it should be of all of us together.
And very concerning, I have to say. And I see it, unfortunately, all over the place, and a lot of the media outlets. And I think that anyone that cares deeply about the future and the vibrancy of our democracy should also definitely be concerned. I do want to get to why we're here, and that is to talk about your new podcast called Crossroads, Jewish Crossroads, the Jewish Identity in Times of Crisis. Welcome, first of all, to JPPI. It's great to have you as another fellow at the Institute. But tell us about what your podcast is, what it's about, what you're trying to achieve, who are your guests, what are you guys talking about, and what did you seek out in this journey to learn from the people that you've been talking and meeting with?
So, as you mentioned, it's called Jewish Crossroads, and we delve into the impact of October 7th and the ongoing war on American Jewry, on Jewish identity in the U.S. We explore how, the events are shaping and, in a way, reshaping the way American Jews perceive themselves and their connection to Israel. Naturally, the rising wave of anti-Semitism and its intensifying effects have become a dominant part of many of the conversations, along with the situation on American campuses and the aftermath of recent elections. And in each episode, I just delve into a meaningful conversation with one leading Jewish figure to explore these topics. Our first guest was Rabbi David Wolpe, and if anyone in the audience haven't listened to it yet, this is a warm recommendation because he's really incredible.
I'll second that recommendation.
Speaker.
A very interesting episode. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a fascinating, person with fascinating insights. And this week, we've just launched our second episode with renowned author Nicole Krauss. Well, we talk about a lot of topics, but newsworthy. She talks very sincerely and openly about her concern about the future of American Jewish writing and how freely American writers can write about Jewish identity and, include Israeli characters in their books. She's not sure that in the future she will be read. And she has a very, very interesting answer to, can a new Nicole Krauss emerge today in the current atmosphere in the culture world in the U.S. So those are our two first guests, but we will really try to bring voices from the worlds of culture, philosophy, academia, religious leadership, major Jewish organization leaders, hopefully to a thought-provoking dialogue.
No, it's a great product, a great podcast, and I do strongly recommend that everyone listen to more of an in-depth conversation with a lot of these thinkers. I'm curious, though, Tamar, because you come with your own ideas, beliefs, identity, experience. You know the issues very well. What would you say that you personally are learning from these conversations that you're having?
First of all, I must say that I approached this project with a lot of curiosity and humility, because I am not an American Jew. I'm Israeli, but I think that's what's interesting in this dialogue between a curious Israeli and very, thoughtful speakers that I speak with. However, I do see these two key issues that I find truly fascinating that come up rapidly in these conversations. I think the first one is the reconnection that many Jews feel to their Jewish identity since October 7th. And, I find this particularly intriguing because I'm talking about people who are often referred to as the nones, right? The non-affiliated individuals who don't send their kids to Jewish schools or Jewish summer camps, and they're not part of activities of the Jewish federations. Maybe they'll go to shul on high holidays. Sometimes they won't. And what fascinates me is that, in such shocking and challenging times, many of these individuals have felt a renewed connection to their Jewish identity. Now, as an Israeli, I assume that, maybe if being a Jew bears with it much more consequences, and it's much harder to be a Jew today or to support Israel today, they might have, distanced themselves even further from being Jewish, because it comes with a greater challenge and stakes. And they didn't. They didn't detach completely from Jewish peoplehood. On reality, the opposite has happened to many of them, and I find that truly, truly remarkable. And the second thing, which was very interesting for me as Israeli, wasn't the deep empathy that Americans felt and Jewish Americans felt towards Israel, because that we know and appreciate. But what I guess did surprise me to an extent is how central Israel is to their personal Jewish identity. I think I haven't fully recognized just how deeply intertwined, Israel's existence is with their sense of being Jewish, even those who may have, only been to Israel once in their bar mitzvah. And Israel serves as this makom, as this place that is a place of security. It's a place of strength. And I think that the way it represents a foundation of their identity in a way that I didn't fully grasp beforehand. So that
Yeah.
was very interesting for me.
No, it's very interesting, and I want to wrap up asking you a question that I don't know if you'll yet have a good answer, or yeah, I'm sure you'll have a good answer. I'll say that differently. I don't know if you'll have the full answer, a comprehensive answer, because you've only been now in the U.S. for just a few months, so your answer might change, by within after a year. But I am curious now that you're on that side of the pond. We recognize obviously the importance of the connection, and we at JPPI work a lot on studying and researching and analyzing what are the key drivers for how to strengthen the connection between Israel and the diaspora. How can we strengthen the resilience of that connection and bridge the divide that definitely exists on issues like the war, as we were just discussing, what Nicole Krauss was talking to you about. I mean, and so much more. I'm curious now that you're looking at it from that side of things now in the U.S., how do you see it? What does it look like from there? And you kind of did just touch upon just how important Israel plays a role, but so what should we be doing then? We as in Israel.
Well, I think that, Israelis today have a much deeper appreciation for the burden of Jewish identity that American Jews carry, how they are facing the consequences of our war here in the U.S., in their communities, in their streets, in the campuses, because of, the rise of anti-Semitism. And I think that means that we need to think about American Jewry much more and about the responsibility that we as Israelis have to American Jewry. Now, obviously, the Israeli government needs, first of all, to think about the interests of Israelis, Jews, Muslim, and Christians in Israel. But I think we all the time need to bear in mind the influence of our actions on American Jewry. It has to do, with the war, but I'm talking much more broadly about the connection between them and us when it comes to questions of, religion and state and so forth. And we started this conversation by talking about the opportunity we have now, because something I think really important has changed on both sides of the understanding of this connection, of this Jewish peoplehood. But I'm optimistic, but if I could add a grain of salt, I think that this renewed connection cannot rely solely on individuals. It has to be, in a way, institutionalized. And in that sense, I think that organizations like the JPPI can play a crucial role in this effort.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I also think that, and I don't know if I should say what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyhow, but also how much the government can impact and ruin. And when you have the wrong people and the wrong jobs, and, we have a diaspora ministry, and I'm not going to talk about the minister for a moment, but it just underscores exactly what you're saying, is how crucial doing things the right way, how much that has value. Tamar, thank you so much for joining me. It was really a great conversation. And again, to all our listeners who have been listening to this podcast now for about the last year, you have a new one, the Jewish Crossroads. It's a great listen. You'll want to hear it. David Wolpe, Nicole Krauss, and more to come, of course, with Tamar Ish Shalom. So Tamar, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Yaakov. And I must say, just before we started this recording, I thought you really have to have another podcast that would be called The Podcuts.
That's a good one. I've never heard that before. That's nice.
Bye. Take
Okay,
care.
thank you. Thank you for joining today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, of course, YouTube, and the Times of Israel's website. We'll be back on Thursday with another episode of the Jewish